This lecture is on virtual communities, understanding social media. Before we move on to looking at virtual communities and looking at social media as well, we first have to start by really examining the link between both communication and community. There is already a lecture recorded on the different definitions and understandings of the word communication that you can look up on the Google site or my YouTube page. So I'm going to give this lecture on the assumption that you already know what that means or you've already listened to that lecture. So in order to really think about communication and community, we have to understand that communication is not only about transmission. Communication is also about the reception of that message and then the next response that we give. And Raymond Williams says that any real theory of communication is a theory of community. And why is that? Because he says, he argues that anytime you're communicating in a particular code, in a particular set of meanings, a particular set of understandings. As such, for that communication to work with that audience itself has to be aware of our code, our language, our meanings, and our understandings. As such, when we communicate to an audience, we're actually engaging in an activity of building a mutual understanding within a group of people, which is a way of thinking about communicating, about community. It is very difficult to think clearly about communication because the pattern of our thinking is about community is normally dominative. What he's saying here is that when we talk about that communication that we're engaging with the community, there are dominant meanings, there are dominant ways of understanding what is being said. And that is, again, only something that can happen when you are a part of that community. And in particular, understand the dominant meanings of words. Words can have dominant meanings, and they can have meanings that are minority meanings, or meanings that are not as popular. So within a community, there are meanings that we understand, and there are also words that have different meanings within the same community. So when we are engaging in communication, not only are we expecting our audience to be part of that community, whether it's a big community or a small community, we also then expect them to understand how those meanings of those words connect up to a larger ideology. Again, this is stuff that I've covered in my lecture on communication. Williams goes on to write that communication becomes a science of penetrating the mass mind and of registering an impact there. It is not easy thinking along different lines. Now, that is perhaps obvious at some level, but it's something that I think is always very important to be aware of. The community in which we communicate, in which the meanings and the codes and understandings have been fixed and agreed upon within members of that community, are often not even aware of the meanings that they've ascribed, the meanings that they've agreed upon. It's something that develops over time and is contested on a regular basis, but is developed over time, as such that the people within that group can often not even understand that there are different ways of thinking about things. So what's important here is to understand what Raymond Williams is talking about, is that when we talk about communication, we have to talk about community. There are two ideas that are extremely strongly interlinked, because only way communication can happen is that when we engage in it with an audience that has the same meanings, understanding, codes, and language as us, as such, forming part of that community. Another way of thinking about community comes from the sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies. Now, he talks about community and society. So we're going to look at both those ideas. Let's start off by looking at community. Here he talks about notions of membership, fellowship, kinship, fraternity, where there is a common belief, values, and attitudes. Now, those of you who've listened to the lecture on culture would know that that is one of the definitions of culture: beliefs, attitudes, and values. And having one in common is usually a sign that you belong or have an investment in the society. Some of the other markers he looks at when he talks about community is responsibility over self-interest. So when you're in a part of a community, you have a tendency to take on responsibility for your actions for that community rather than work in the interests of yourself. There is a unity of will. That means we're all trying to move in the same direction. We're trying to get the same things done. There is a high investment in the group of people. This means that we have a fair amount of, whether it's emotional investment or psychological investment or cultural investment, in the group of people that are in our community. We have a shared emotional connection with them, a shared emotional history with them, and importantly, we have the ability to be influenced directly, but also to influence the community directly. And that is an important thing. So when we talk about community, we're talking about those high levels of investment, social, cultural, economic, political, so on. But you're also talking about shared history, shared knowledges, and communities have a tendency to be able to impact you and affect you directly. And you also, as a member of the community, have an ability to affect and influence that community. And because of this high level of interconnection between all the different members in that community, you have a high level of connection and connections that are fairly dense and thick and interwoven. So you have a high level of integration. A lot of these networks or relationships overlap and connect to each other, connect over each other. So you have a lot of people here that have a lot of friends in common, a lot of ideas in common, values in common, and they care about the people who belong to that community. When we look at Ferdinand Tony's notion of society, well, here it gets slightly more abstracted. So he talks about society as a abstracted sense of belonging, whether this is geographic, political, cultural, and so on. Here, what drives the group is the self-interest. Now, in a community, we talked about responsibility over self-interest. And often this is because in a community, you can see directly the members of your community being affected by your actions. In a society, because it's such a large abstracted group, that when you engage in self-interest behavior, it's often not something that manifests itself in an obvious way to you. So it's easy to privilege self-interest over the interests of the group. Societies also tend to have the culture of end result and achievement. So this is the idea that you focus on what is the outcome that you want and how you can get the best type of achievements from it. It is usually a group of people that are defined through secondary relationships. So these are not your immediate friendship groups. So we're not even talking about people that are related to your friends, but perhaps even sort of that Kevin Bacon-esque, 6 circles removed type of relationships. So they're outside of your immediate group. And if that's the case, that usually means that you have significantly reduced emotional, cultural investment into this group of people. Because when you try to influence it, the society that is, it has little or no influence on society. As such, you tend to then reduce the emotional investment, psychological, cultural investment that you have in that larger group. But it also works vice versa in the sense that the society itself has little ability to influence you directly. You might get influence as society moves towards a position, a normative position as a collective, but as a direct influence, that's highly unlikely. As such, because we're talking about secondary relationships, reduced investment, emotional investment in the group, your connections within society tend to be quite light and quite not very dense. They tend to be shallow, thin relationships that can be replaced or moved on from fairly simply. So that's what Ferdinand Tönnies talks about when we talk about community and society. And I think when we link this back up with what Raymond Williams was talking about when he talked about how communication and community, basically go hand in hand, this is a very useful way for us to think about the types of communication that we engage in, whether we're engaging with people who are members of a community high levels of emotional investment, ability to influence and be influenced, or whether we're engaging in some kind of communication with an abstracted group of secondary relationships which are lightly connected, i.e. society. So I think it's a really useful way to start thinking about the types of communication that engage in them. Why does community matter? Well, as we talked about earlier, the individual is best understood as a node in a series of networks, whether these be communication networks or emotional networks and so on. But the individual is one point of connections. And at this node, the individual is constituted by membership in the number of communities in which the individual has influence and is influenced by. So you as an individual are a node that sits in a network of relationships, and you have a series of memberships in various communities. This could be your religious communities, your high school communities, your local sports team communities, your hobbies, family, friend, and so on. And these communities in which you have an influence and can be influenced by, we have a high level of emotional investment. All of these communities connect up to each other and give you a sense of not just belonging, but a sense of who you are. As such, these communities have a social contract within themselves, which might be along the lines of, if we look at family groups, kinship groups, there is an understanding and a contract between the different members of that family group as to expectations, responsibilities, who's responsible for what kind of care. If something goes wrong, who can you reach out to, and so on. So community matters because you as an individual sit in a network of relationships, which also you are part of in terms of a number of communities. And each of these communities have different versions of the social contract that govern how you engage with them. So this is a very sort of basic understanding of the relationship between what communication is, what community is, what society is, and why these matter. Now, when we start looking at mediated communities, one of the most influential theorists in mediated communities Benedict writes about imagined communities, and this has been a highly influential theory around how media and comm practitioners can understand the way in which their audience gets constituted. Now, this is a quote from Anderson. He writes that, "I propose the following definition of a nation. It's an imagined political community that's imagined both inherently limited and sovereign." So he's talking about a nation, and this is perhaps more similar to what we talked about when we talked about society, right? So he talks about nation, and it's similar to what we talked about society, which is both inherently limited and sovereign. And this is important. He says it's imagined because even the members of the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each other lives the image of their communion. What he's saying here is that as members of a nation or society, we don't know most of the people who are fellow members of that nation or of that society, yet we have a sense of them. Now, how is this sense created? And that is where the notion of imagined community comes about. And Anderson, interestingly, uses the notion of communion, the gathering and the sharing of certain sort of large belief. Anderson continues, in fact, all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact are imagined. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity and genuineness, but by the style in which they're imagined. What does he mean here? Well, he's saying that all communities larger than villages that only have face-to-face contact, and perhaps even those then, are in a large sense imagined. They're built in our imagination. They're built in imagination not by notions of what's real or not real, but how we come to understand them. This goes back quite interestingly to the notions of culture or meaning, where we're looking at a group of people, an audience, a community, a society that are governed by a sense of who they are, what they believe in, what their shared experiences are, what their histories are. And Anderson is talking about here how when we talk about these communities, to a large extent, they're not any way real physical manifestations. They're in fact imagined by the people who are involved in it and then given its identity. He goes on to say that finally, it is imagined as a community because regardless of actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is the fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people, not so much as to kill, as to willingly die for such limited imaginings. Now, in the rest of the book, Anderson talks about things like reaching into the past immemorial. That is, that we build our sense of that nation, of the society, by reaching into the stories of our past, the stories of our history, that give us a sense of who we are, how we've come to be, how we have gained meaning, how we construct ourselves. And we then use these common constructions to have relationships with the people with whom we engage in. Now, where this is useful for media and comm practitioners is starting to think about, well, how does my audience, my community, my society constitute itself through their imagining? Where is this common engagement with some form of meaning making happening? Now, at one level, you can look at it as something everybody's reading the same newspapers, or watching the same television programs, or engaging in the same, reading the same books, and so on and so forth. And this activity, this communion of consumption of media, gives people a sense of what their fellow citizens, their fellow society members, community members are doing. And it helps them understand that their involvement in that requires a similar sort of behavior. So when Anderson talks about that beautiful phrase, reaching into the past memorial, to use the legacy of our histories to create a sense of identity for which we will willingly die for. And we see this playing out, unfortunately, all over the world, where people ascribe to various, affirmations or beliefs that are really only, again, imaginings of a past. So what's useful for us at the end of the day for Anderson is that Anderson particularly focuses on the notion of mediated imagined communities. These communities that are created through the consumption of some form of media. So if we're all watching the same television programs and reading the same newspapers and so on, we would have the same sense of the community in which we're engaging with and have a deep sense of involvement with the people in our community. So that's Anderson talking about mediated imagined communities. And Anderson talked particularly about newspapers and novels. To understand virtual communities, we go to Howard Rheingold. And Rheingold talks about virtual communities. And Rheingold was involved in virtual communities very early in the day and has written many books on it. And I think one of the most interesting ways he's defined these virtual communities is as social aggregations that emerge from the net when enough people carry on those public discussions long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. Now, this is a pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter definition of virtual communities. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Rheingold defines this even pre-HTML, with where you're looking at people using, engaging in these conversations in sort of only text-based communities. But I think it's a definition that still is robust enough and well thought through that we can still use it in the age of social media that we are in today. So what he's talking about here is that whenever you have a group of people online, and this applies now today, whether we look at Facebook or Meetup or any other social networking sites, we have enough people that have enough investment in an idea, enough emotional investment and care in an idea or a topic, that they're willing to engage in these public discussions long term. And through these long term public discussions about things they're highly invested in, they end up forming relationships with people. And this is still a definition that we can use when we talk about we talk about online communities. And what's different from what Rheingold does from Anderson is Rheingold is starting to talk explicitly about moving away from a spatial fixedness. Now, when Anderson talks about mediated imagined communities, he's referring specifically to communities that are fixed in space. What I mean by that is sort of geographically fixed. They're located in a place and time, and they're defined by their place and time. When Rheingold talks about those communities, he's no longer looking at communities that are fixed in space or time, but rather that live in a virtual space, so you can form these relationships outside of wherever you live and where you exist. Now, a useful way to think about this is the notion of space-time distanciation. And this is best defined as the disembedding of traditional forms of relationships, disembedding traditional forms of relationships, standard and abstract dimensions of space and time come to order and rationalize these activities in the space of local context. What that says basically is this: that the way we form relationships have traditionally been defined by how far we can travel, how far we can walk, how far we can get access to information. With the advent of the virtual, that is no longer, the tyranny of space is no longer a hindrance to the formation of relationships. So you can literally rip people out of where they live, and they can still engage in these relationships, these conversations, and have community without needing to be in a particular space and time. So what he talks about here is the abstract dimensions that come to order and rationalize activities. That means we no longer need to be in a particular place, but we can start looking at more abstracted relationships. So that's Rheingold taking us from Anderson's mediated analog media to his digital virtual communities. So this brings us back to Raymond Williams and starting to think about community and media and trying to link all of the things that we've spoken about, whether from Raymond Williams talking about the fact that all forms of communication is a form of community, and then looking particularly at what Anderson talks about in mediated imagined communities, built through a common imagining, a sense of communion with your fellow community members, society members, and nation members. And there's more things he talks about in his work, where he talks about notions of how that is used to build some form of identity and understanding, to where we start looking at Rheingold, who says, well, you don't need to be fixed in time and space. You can continue to have these types of relationships, whether they're community relationships or societal relationships, as defined by Ferdinand Tönnies, to continue to engage. So that's really where community, new media, digital media comes into its forefront. So Raymond Williams says that society is a form of communication through which experience is described, shared, and modified and preserved. And those of you astute enough would have realized that that's also very similar to the definition, one of the definitions of the word media. Described, shared, modified, and preserved. So we cannot really talk about community or society without bringing the notion of communication in, because communication is through which that community and that society actually gets a sense of who they are, what they are, and to some extent even why they are. So those ideas are very, very intrinsically linked, and I think Williams makes this point quite well. Societies are not merely about relationships of power, property, and productions, but also of learning, persuading, and the exchange of experiences. And I think this is another very powerful thing to keep in mind, that when we talk about being members of a community, when we talk about being members of society, and as common media practitioners, when we talk about our audiences, we need to move away from thinking of our audiences in terms of merely the broadcast mindset of recipients of our communication, but rather as collaborators in learning, persuading, and exchanging of those experiences. And that's why I think where social media comes into play and becomes quite an interesting space. So, what is social media? I think social media is a difficult thing. Well, it's not difficult. It's one of those things that I don't think needs to be defined with any new definitions. Media is quite clearly defined, and to a large extent, all media is social. So, when we talk about social media, we can think about it in two of these ways. One is that social media is not about what each of us says it does, but about what we do and say together worldwide to communicate in all directions by any possible means. Now, that definition is really starting to talk about building of community and society. We want to talk about and say together with everybody else. We're not trying to communicate in a broadcast model. We're not trying to be, I think it's Kanye West who only has one follower on Twitter. We're trying to be a lot more communicative, a lot more engaged with our audience than not. Social media are the platforms that enable interactive web by engaging users to participate in, comment, create content as a means of communication with your social graph, other users, and the public. So this particular definition by Cohen starts looking at social media more from a technology platform-based idea, but it's still about getting people to engage in creating content. So one of the key differences I think with social media that you don't really see, particularly in the early mediated imaging communities, the role of the user in actually creating that content that allows the community to engage with each other. And that I think to some extent I would argue is fairly recent. We've usually relied on institutions to create the content, but with social media, we are more and more relying on the users to create the content. So when I talk about social media, why am I interested in social media? What do I think social media offers? And how would I go about thinking about social media that is different from traditional media, or even differentiates itself a little bit more from just generic new media? So when I talk about social media, I'm interested in these key ideas. The first is the compression of space and time. In social media, space and time has been compressed to the extent as to render geography or space irrelevant. Now, this is already what the internet does, right? This is already what digital media does. So it's not anything new or different from the internet or any web page. But this compression is done to the level of the individual in a network. So traditionally, like when the crocodile hunter died, the internet went into a meltdown and the BBC and CNN sites collapsed due to the amount of people that were going to visit those sites. These days, however, we are more likely to go to Twitter and Facebook to look for the same kind of information rather than more institutional websites. So in that sense, that compression of space and time is more curated to the level of what you are interested in, or the audience is interested in. So it really targets much better. Social media also accelerates connectivity in communication. So it compresses space and time and accelerates connectivity in communication, especially with something like Twitter, Facebook, where you actually go to that message. So you say, I'm really interested to know new information about product X, and you can like the product X, so you can follow their Twitter feed and so on. So that connection is a lot more tangible and a lot more real. It's moving a lot further away from the broadcast model and much closer to sort of a, one would argue, perhaps even a curated model of communication. And I think social media lets us do that in a very simple way. And finally, when we look at the role of the individual as a node in networks and relationships within communities, societies, and nation, in social media, that compression, that depth, is far more accelerated and far more dense than it would be in any other forms of media, such as traditional media, but also in more other digital media like emails or websites. So the key thing that social media offers us that other websites, that other digital media don't do, is that compression, that connection that is built within the node of the individual and defines how the individual connects itself with community, societies, and nation. So one of the exercises that we do is the community communication, community technology mapping, and that's really trying to understand how you as an individual fit within this moray of things that are going on. So to summarize, when we talk about virtual communities, we talk about the evolution of communication across different technological platforms. The important thing to understand is communication is always about connecting people to communities, connecting people to society, and to give a sense of the nation. That's where we have we use the work of Ferdinand Tönnies to understand what community is and what society is, and then we use the work of Anderson, which is very useful, to actually think about how mediated imagined communities are created. And this is really useful when we start looking at more traditional broadcast models, but also things like websites and emails. There's a sort of really simple way of understanding it. When we start looking at the Rheingold model of virtual communities, that's moving closer to the platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where it's relying on the users themselves to engage over an extended period of time and create this sense of their connections within a community and a nation. And I think when we start talking about social media, we actually have to understand that, I guess, if you, for the want of a description, social media will sit at the end of that continuum, where it's going, the virtual community continuum, in the sense that it's right at the end, where it is enabling a whole different way of engaging with the community, with your audience, and with your nation, your society. And as media practitioners, we have to find a way not just to understand how these things are going, but also when we craft and create communication messages, we have to understand how the audience is expecting that communication and message and what they'll be doing with that. Thank you for listening.